Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I start by acknowledging that we're meeting tonight on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The topic tonight is access to justice, law, policing and power. And I also want to acknowledge the racist policing and the ongoing impacts of colonisation that has led to over 550 Aboriginal people dying in custody since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody 32 years ago. 3 Aboriginal deaths in custody have occurred in just the last fortnight, and it's inappropriate to start an event like this without acknowledging that. We're living through a really harrowing time, and it would also be inappropriate to hold an event like this without acknowledging what we're witnessing in Gaza. We're witnessing what the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Palestine has said amounts to a mass ethnic cleansing of Palestinians by Israel. All strength to those impacted by this human rights catastrophe, and all power to those marching in the streets calling for justice and a free Palestine. I'm Monique Hurley, Managing Lawyer at the Human Rights Law Centre and your host tonight. This event is being held in partnership with the Victorian Legal Services Board, and I'm humbled to be sitting before you tonight alongside this panel. On the panel, we've got Veronica Gorrie, a proud Gunai Kurnai woman and an award-winning author for her memoir, Black and Blue, a memoir of racism and resilience. Ronnie's next book, When the Cops Are Criminals, will be published next year. Next to her, we've got Isabelle Reinecke, the founder of the Grata Fund, a leading not-for-profit that acts as a campaigner, litigation incubator and funder for people in communities challenging systemic injustice. She's also the author of Courting Power, Law, Democracy and the Public Interest in Australia. And next to me, we've got Dan Box, a Walkley Award-winning journalist and best-selling author. We'll be discussing his most recent book tonight, The Man Who Wasn't There. So the plan is for us to have a bit of a discussion for about 45 minutes and then an audience Q&A for the last 10 to 15 minutes, for which we'll have ushers with roving mics. The bookseller for this event is up the back, Mary Martin Bookshop, and the speakers will be signing copies of their respective books after this event. And so, as we start, I've got some questions for the panel, and I'm going to start with you, Ronnie. Before we came on stage, you mentioned that you had got some distressing news today about a loved one dying in custody, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk to that if you'd like to.
Thanks, Monique. So today we've just found out there's a third death in custody in the matter of 2 weeks. I won't mention his name because it's not public just yet, but my respect goes and acknowledgement to all the families of. So I've spent the whole day with the families today because they're in Naarm, and it's just a terrible time for them at the moment. Yep.
Yeah, really, really sorry for your loss and really grateful that you're here tonight with us despite all of that going on in the background. We're also all really privileged to have the opportunity to read your memoir. And I want to thank you for writing that and for sharing your story with us all. From your memoir, we know that you're many things: a proud Aboriginal woman, daughter, mother, grandmother, sister, writer, storyteller, and a survivor. You're also a former police officer. Now, that doesn't define you, it's only one chapter in your life. But if you don't mind, I'd like you to tell us a bit about why you decided to join the Queensland Police Force and what your experience was there.
I think with Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, when we join, places where systemic racism are known, we all join with the same intent, that we want to make changes and that we want to look after our people. So prior to me joining the police, I had this grand idea that I would change the way, help my people in the community, how they saw police, and that police were here to help you as well. But only just being in for a short time, I realised that I couldn't do that because I was quite well aware of the fear that my people had in the community, because I was treated really bad as a copper as well. So their fears were well and truly justified.
In your memoir, you say that racism lives and breathes in the police, and you speak to a number of examples of police brutality and racism that you witnessed during your time there. When the police do bad things, often we hear that it's just a few bad apples. It's not something for us to worry about. But I think that we know that a few bad apples can spoil the barrel, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about how systemic racism is within policing and how you think that impacts on how police treat people.
Yeah, well, just no police officer's ever been made accountable for any of the deaths in custody that they've caused, the murders that they've caused. I'll speak briefly about the ones that's just happened. The versions of events that happened with this young Noongar man is different to the witnesses. It was a planned arrest. 13 cops turned up to this address with ambulance and a drone. I've never been to a job where I've been attended with the ambulance, so they're preempting an injury already and that he's going to be needing medical attention. So that's quite worrying. As black people, we know that we're racially profiled. It's really bad, and cops are cunts. Sorry for the language. Yeah.
I will go to Dan now.
Please.
Thanks.
Dan, your book, The Man Who Wasn't There, tells the story of an Indigenous man, Zach Grieve, who was released on parole recently after spending 12 years in prison. In the book, you say, and I'm not sure if it's you or if it's the judge, that there is no justice in the Territory. Having myself worked in the Northern...
No, that's me. I don't think he'd be very happy with that because he is a judge in the Northern Territory.
So you've said that, just to make the record clear. Yeah. As someone who's worked in the Northern Territory, I agree with that and can confirm that to be true. Would you be able to tell us a bit about Zach as a person, who he is, where he's from, what are his interests, and how you came to write about his story?
Yeah, and look, I'm going to defer to this. Probably several people in the room who know the Territory better than I do, including Ronnie, who's spent a lot of time up there. I'm no expert at all. I can only talk to what I saw and what I found. But with Zach, what I found was a young guy who is a writer. He writes science fiction, he writes poetry, some of it really bad poetry, but some of it really good, who is a decent, kind. He got me through a couple of times in my life which were hard, and there was no one else except for Zach to get me through them, even though he was in a prison cell on the far side of the world at that point, and who in a lot of ways probably saved me a couple of times, and who is also a convicted murderer and went down for a murder that even the judge said he didn't physically commit, and the judge said, I have no choice with the laws the way they're written in the Territory, but to send you down for life, and life in the Territory means life, with a minimum 20 years of non-parole. And so when I kind of came into this, and I came into it for all the wrong reasons, I didn't come into it because I liked Zach particularly, I didn't know him at that point. I came into it because I thought it was an interesting story, and maybe it might win me an award if I reported on it. And I came into it with all the wrong reasons, and yet Zach's family trusted me and let me learn a little bit about them. And then that's been 7 years of Zach and I writing letters back and forth ever since. And now I'm proud to say that Zach's my friend.
So who wrote the book, Zach or you?
We wrote letters to each other for 7 years.
Yep.
Ballpark 7 years.
Is he getting any, are you going to help him financially, like with the
From the
proceeds
book?
of the sale of the book?
The deal we agreed, and this was what Zach said in his letters, was he didn't want any money, and he was happy for me to write it the way I saw that I'd go about writing it. But there's a lot of Zach's words in there, both words that he told me and words that he wrote to me. And in as many places as I've tried to, I've used his words and his mum's words and his dad's words and his brother's words.
Oh, that's lovely. Sorry to take over this.
No, this
panel,
is all right. It's a fair question. Zach's not going to get any money out of the sale of the book. No.
I haven't read your book yet, Dan. It's probably really amazing. Did you interview police? Did you have access to the police?
Police refused to talk to me through.
Oh, right, okay. Yep. Cool.
So, I got their accounts from their witness statements in court and the evidence they gave in court, and they have refused to have a bar with me ever since.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Oh, no, that's it. All good. As you were.
Just as a follow-up to that, you talked about mandatory sentencing laws in the NT and how they caused what happened to Zach to happen. For people that might be unfamiliar with those laws, can you just explain briefly how mandatory sentencing operates?
Mandatory sentencing is a weird thing in that it's where the politicians essentially say we don't trust the judges to sentence criminals once they're found guilty. So the politicians say, if you're found guilty of this crime, then you are going to go to jail for this amount of time. So the judges have no freedom to say, these are the circumstances, this is the person, this is what happened in this particular instance to this particular person. They can't shape the law to have a just outcome. They have to put down what the politician says. And I'm not a politician, I haven't written any of these laws, but looking at it from an outside, it often seems to me that it comes back to politicians often wanting to be seen to be tough on crime. And a lot of politicking goes into drawing up these laws that make the politicians look as if they are tough on crime. I don't think they work. One of the reasons I don't think they work is a number of prosecutors in the territory have told me they actually make it harder to prosecute murders because there's no reason for a man or a woman who's accused of murder to plead guilty because they're going to go to jail for life, so they can't get a discount, which means they have to go to trial, which means you have to bring in an army of lawyers, you have to spend millions on a court, and there's no reason for the accused person to cooperate with the law at all. So they actually say as a result of that, because you never know what the jury's going to say, you probably have got some people who are guilty, refuse to admit they were guilty, who are walking free today because of the way the mandatory sentencing distorts the law. And I'm sorry if I've kind of gone off on one about it. You just asked for a very brief introduction.
Yeah, just sorry, I'm going to pop in again. It's me again. Just keep in mind that the Northern Territory is highly populated Aboriginal communities, so those legislations are in place to put my people away. Yeah.
That's one of the things that Zach's mum always told me, because she's jingly Mudborough herself. She always told me that she thought the whole system was there to make money out of putting Aboriginal people in jail, because she said the federal government actually gave money to the Northern Territory government depending on the number of people who were in jail. So she said they kind of see it, I'm obviously paraphrasing, these are not her words, but she did say that we are enterprise to them, we are a business to them. The more of her people, she said, they put in jail, the more money they got. Now, obviously, no one in the Northern Territory government agreed with that when I asked them about it, but that's Glennis's opinion based on a lifetime of living up there.
Yes, my opinion is that the mandatory sentencing laws are also racist. And so, Isabelle, we've had Ronnie talk about racism in policing, mandatory sentencing laws are racist. The legal system is a really problematic place. But that's not all. The courts are supposed to provide a check on government, and it's supposed to be a venue where people can go and hold power to account, but there's a lot of issues that people experience trying to do that. Could you speak to some of those issues and tell us a bit about why you set up the Grata Fund?
Yeah, sure. I'd also like to pay my respects to traditional owners of this land and also acknowledge where I come from. I come from Bundjalung country in Northern Rivers, New South Wales, really beautiful part of the world. I feel very lucky to be here. And yeah, I mean, I'm the first person to say that law has and is used to systemically oppress First Nations people in particular, and also other aspects of, other people in our society. And I'm a lawyer. And I'm a non-Indigenous lawyer, and that's something that is, front of mind for me every day doing the work that I do. And what that work is really trying to provide access to the power that is inherent in our legal system to people who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. I think the court system it's interesting because, we often think of the court system as being about, settling divorces, putting people in jail, settling corporate disputes or property disputes. But actually the starting point, the reason that we've really got courts in our society is about accountability of governments, funnily enough, including police, as part of the government. And it's something that culturally in Australia we don't think about very often, but it's something I believe we should think about more. And I think the best of our system we see when courts are accessed by everyday people to hold those powerful entities accountable. I think, a really good example of that is a case that was decided just last week with Monique's organisation at the helm, which was to overturn, a decade or multi-decade long now decision that said that it was appropriate not appropriate, but lawful for the government to send people to prison indefinitely through detention. So if you were a person seeking asylum and you didn't have any other country to be sent home to, you could be held indefinitely. And the thing that is so disturbing about that is that there's no process, there's no judge even applying a law. That is literally just whoever happened to be appointed the Minister for Immigration or Home Affairs had the power to actually just put people in jail for the rest of their lives. And I think it speaks to the power of the court that the court was able to then kind of walk back from that over time with good evidence. But I think the other thing that's important to think about in that context that really, I think, reinforces the role of the court in our democratic system is that the news reporting, ever since that decision has come out, has been focused on X number of people are now being released into our community and they are dangerous for XYZ reason. They have been convicted of whatever crime has been a crime of their past. And I think it's quite alarming that the media reporting of this, which is essentially, on some level, a sort of boring decision about governance and separation of powers, has very quickly, even from media outlets that you would think would know better, descended into this sort of spin kind of language of it's criminals on the streets, they should, what do you say, Human Rights Law Centre, what do you say that there are criminals now on the streets? And, obviously there are very sensible responses to that, including the fact that, well, these people weren't in a jail for these crimes. They had, received terms that they'd been previously convicted of and served their terms. But the point is actually that regardless of whatever the spin is in media, the court actually found that at a core principle, at a core level, it's just not appropriate for a minister to be able to send someone to prison for the rest of their lives. And I think that shows sort of the best of the court's power in a way. So to me, the best of the court's power is being able to cut through the politics and cut through the spin to actually air the facts. And that's really, really important when you have the potential to air the facts, not for somebody who's walking down the street, but for actually a government who otherwise has no opportunity to really be interrogated. I think that's why, royal commissions and those sorts of inquiries can be so satisfying to watch, because you see often former judges grill politicians and they really can't get out of it. You see it as well in America at the moment with Trump, with the trials that he's facing, where, he actually has an opportunity for a forum where the facts actually matter. However, courts are obviously really unsafe places for lots of people. And I think that shows the worst of our system as well. So I don't want to overstate the benefits of our judicial system, but I do want to draw our attention to the fact that it has this really important role. We have a democracy that has three parts to our government. We have the executive, we have our prime ministers and our ministers. We also have our legislature, we've got a parliament, and we've got our judiciary. And their number one job, their first job in our constitution, is to hold the other two pieces of the puzzle to account. And really that's what Grata Fund is about, and so that's why we provide funding, we provide community organising support and campaign support to enable communities to actually send the government to court and for the government to have their day in court, where they're actually interrogated under the bright lights of a courtroom for once and actually held accountable to what the law says.
Does Grata help families of deaths in custody?
We haven't to date helped a family with deaths in custody.
Can you start?
Well, we can. I mean, we helped actually with a case of, I think, a family member related to a coronial. Mm-hmm. And that's been a starting point for us. I think our focus has really been about finding litigation that holds those perpetrators accountable.
Yeah,
and I
which
think
are the cops and anyone in
Exactly.
carceral authoritarian
Yes,
positions.
exactly. And so with those systems, I think we are still looking for the pathway that the law provides for us to be able to seek proper accountability for corrections, for policing, so that they actually are held account. The criminal system is not doing its job in that respect, and so we need to find other ways of doing it.
Yeah, right. Because I know the Common Walker matters, they'd probably need support as well.
Yeah,
up there.
absolutely.
Yeah, and this latest one as well. And just want the audience to know that the cops were first formed in this country by the best 10 convicts. Have a think about that. Boom, boom.
Yeah.
Sorry, popping in again. Yeah.
But I think, your point is important because, the courts can only go as far as what the law allows. So what I think for me, the exciting part of the work at Grata is finding creatively how can we hold governments and the machinery of governments accountable for their actions.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily really obvious all of the time how you can do that. And I'll give an example of a couple of cases that we've been supporting in the Territory that have just been successful, which have been about housing and water.
Mm-hmm. Read that. Yeah.
Yeah, really happy with those cases results recently. So we've been supporting 2 communities in Central Australia. One's Laramba and one's Santa Teresa, both about an hour or 2 out of Alice Springs. And those communities, like all remote communities in the Territory, face an absolutely appalling standard of housing, despite the fact that people pay really extraordinarily high rents. So I used to live in Tamarama in Sydney, which is the suburb next to Bondi, and I would pay less rent than some of the people who were paying.
2023, and my people are still getting, just now, getting running water in their community. That's fucked up.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And then if you are getting running water, so these communities decided to sue the Northern Territory government for housing repairs. So there are about 600 repairs that had been ignored for over 5 years, despite the community saying, hey, you're our landlord, can you please fix the running sewerage that's moving through our homes? Can you please put a back door back on our home because our back door's fallen off? Can you, do a range of things that are absolutely fundamental and basic to anybody paying decent rent or not in a home? And the government ignored them. And so they ultimately sued the government, and they sued the government using residential tenancies law. So it's not this sort of, from a lawyer's perspective, sexy human rights sort of law. It's residential tenancies laws that every tenant in the country has rights under. And what they were able to do was win and win and win again. And they've got all the way to the High Court, and the High Court has agreed that the Territory government actually has to pay people for the state of housing, they have to undertake the repairs, and they also have to pay them for the reasonable, healthy distress that is caused by living in this state of housing, which is really massive. The other thing that these communities have done is sue the government for the water quality. So if you are getting water, that's one thing, but what is the quality of that water? And people in Laramba, like many people across the Territory, have drinking water that contains uranium. It's toxic. It's got 2.5 times the safe drinking level of uranium in that drinking water. And I don't know about you, but I don't want any times the safe drinking level of uranium in my drinking water. I would like no uranium, thank you very much. Same with people in Laramba. And so they sued the Territory government, and the Territory said, no, we're not responsible. It's not us. But it actually took for the court for them to be forced to actually accept ultimately that the Northern Territory Supreme Court has found that the government does have to provide safe drinking water. You cannot provide toxic drinking water to people. And the government, as a result, has installed safe filtration water systems in Laramba and is now legally responsible to do so across the entire Territory. And I say that because that is hugely transformative, also ridiculous that you need to go to court to get safe drinking water, but you do, it turns out. And when you do, it is transformative. And the thing that's interesting about it, I think, to your question, I think it's I find excitement in my role as a lawyer and an advocate of figuring out, okay, where are the interesting new ways that we can use the legal system that we have, rather than it be used against us. How can we, as the citizenry of this country, use it to hold the powerful accountable? And I think there are really exciting opportunities on the horizon to be able to keep doing that, including in respect of policing.
Yes, I just want to pick up on something that Isabelle said and ask you about it, Ronnie, in terms of the court system is sometimes the only place that police can be held accountable for their actions because we don't have any effective independent oversight of police. When police abuse their powers or when they're responsible for a death in custody, there's no... police investigate themselves. And that is hugely problematic in terms of the conflict of interest, and police investigating their colleagues is never going to result in the kind of justice and accountability that we all want to see. During your time as a police officer, you said in the memoir a few times that, you thought about making a complaint and you didn't make a complaint. I think later on in your career you started making complaints. Can you talk a bit about the culture of impunity within policing and how ineffective the current kind of oversight system for police is?
Yeah, so as a copper, it's like the worst act if you put in a complaint against your fellow officer. I did put in a complaint against one particular racist officer who I saw handcuff an Aboriginal man and then boot him into the face several times, and I just saw teeth coming out of his mouth. He was rendered unconscious for over 20 minutes. Ambulance were called. I did put in a complaint against him, but it didn't go far. And shortly after that, everyone just stopped talking to me as well. But they weren't my mates anyway, they were just my colleagues. So that's, imagine going to it's like a very culturally unsafe space for blackfellas, but as an Aboriginal woman and a single parent as well, so I was minority in so many aspects. So I was ostracised immediately. Yep.
That's horrific. And I think I'd be interested to get your thoughts on when you're helping family of loved ones who have died in custody, and they hear that the police are going to be the ones that are going to investigate a death in custody. Like, how do people react to that?
I just had to speak to the families today because a detective from homicide who is investigating the death in custody, go figure, and then they come up with their little gammon little version of events of what's happened that's led to his death. It just doesn't add up. They're not trusted. As soon as they said that they took the handcuffs off, I knew that they were lying, because I know that cops never do that. But also in my next book, When Cops Are Criminals, if anyone that's read Black and Blue, the next one's going to be even better. It's an anthology. It's going to be a fucking doozy, I tell you. But I'll give you a trigger warning. Whenever I speak, just know that everything that comes out of my mouth is a trigger warning. So when I was in the police, I was sexually assaulted by a very senior police officer. I put in a complaint with the CCC, who is the external body that investigates police, and they emailed me on the day of the last year's NRL Grand Final. They rang me and told me, to tell me that my matter was not serious enough and that they referred it back to the ethical standards, which is cops investigating their own. So if they don't, that's what happened. And that's a sneak peek into my chapter. Yep, spoiler alert.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And at the same time, I'm looking forward to reading the book. So I think we're building a pretty clear picture that we've got a legal system that's pretty rigged. it's rigged in a way that results in the over-policing and the over-incarceration of particular groups of people that it targets, namely Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And it also really fails to hold other groups of people to account at all. I know I'm thinking of perpetrators of family violence, and Dan, I'm thinking also of the Barraville children, Evelyn Greenup, Clinton Speedy Daru, and Colleen Walker-Craig, and the man that likely killed them. I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of thinking that cases like that are isolated, that maybe they're overseas problems like, mass incarceration or different issues. That's a problem in America and it's not a problem here. I just wanted to know whether you had any reflections on Zach's case or other cases that you've worked on in terms of how systemic these issues are.
I think one of the problems I've struggled with trying to even begin to get an answer to that is that I haven't been able to find anyone who's got the statistics. So you mentioned the Barraville case, which for those people who aren't aware of it, was the unsolved murder of 3 children, a little town called Barraville. The police have alleged for decades who killed them. It was a white fella. He has not been convicted. And a couple of times in the years that have followed, I've tried to find out how many unsolved murders of Indigenous people there are, and actually just been unable to find the statistics, partly because no one seems to be really counting them. And you can go to the
It's because our lives don't matter, Dan, that's why. Sorry.
I'm not going to argue with that, but the problem remains that I would have thought somebody would have kept the statistics, because when you do look at the murder statistics from the different police forces, the ones that will give them to you, they have a huge number of statistics, but these don't seem to exist. There's actually a parliamentary inquiry underway at the moment into the murders and disappearances of Aboriginal women and children. And I've gone to them and I've said, do you know what the answer to this is? And they've said, it's one of the questions we're set up to answer. But that's kind of the starting point, is there is a problem there. No one is disputing it. I don't imagine anyone in this room would dispute the problem. But no one knows the extent of the problem. And you actually need a parliamentary inquiry to even start working out how big the problem might be. And that's even before you look at how you maybe respond to the problem. So
I think you can also see that in other aspects of the criminal justice system, especially in relation to First Nations people and people of colour. You see, for example, police, there's not even any reporting requirements around arrests, charges and so on, which means that you can't actually demonstrate any sort of bias because you actually don't have the data in the first place to be able to prove the bias. And I think that's something that's sort of out of step with, even you look at NYPD, which is notoriously kind of racially motivated policing that has kind of confronted communities in New York for decades, and even they're actually at least keeping the data so that actually at least there is some point at which you can claw on and hold someone accountable. And I think that just speaks to broadly the criminal justice system in Australia just has a record-keeping problem, which I would have to say is intentional. If you don't have good records, it's much harder to keep people accountable for their actions.
yeah, except that there's a lot of these kind of deaths that have gone unsolved. And you do have to ask yourself, and I have asked detectives this, why do so many of these cases not seem to get the same answer that white deaths have done? And they talk about distance, and they talk about things being done differently in the old days. But things seem to get done differently a lot in the old days, where these cases just weren't dealt with properly.
I think it's odd that they can't find the records, because when I was a copper, prior to each shift, they'd give you a target, like a figure of RBTs you want me to get, how many arrests they want me to get. So I'm out there targeting people. Yeah, so I find it odd, and then they do keep stats. So I just find it odd that they're not sharing it.
I work with one family whose... So the daughter of the mum I was talking to, her daughter had almost inevitably been killed by a serial killer. This is a different serial killer because I get all the fun jobs. But I was talking to her and then about the fact that the police just basically didn't pursue that case. And then she mentioned that her sister's family, the exact same thing had happened to them. Her sister's daughter had disappeared. The police hadn't solved it. And to go back to your point about record keeping, in that case, they lost the records. So the basic bits of paper that told you what was done at the start of the investigation, the police had lost those. So there was no way of going back to that case and saying, can we at least pick up what was done or what wasn't done? They said they'd been washed away in a flood, like honestly. So that's how widespread the problem is, that one family that's had this happen to them is directly related to another family that's had this happen to them, and the records just aren't there.
Yeah, I just think there was a case in WA where there was an Amber Alert for a young white girl, little kid. Without being disrespectful, but police made all efforts to locate her. But if it's a little Aboriginal kid, then there's no concern. That's the difference.
Yeah, I was actually talking to the aunt of a 4-year-old girl who went missing just today, who's from Bow River, one of the kids who was eventually murdered. And she's told me before, but we were chatting about it, how when she went to report her niece missing, the cop literally said to her, what do you want me to do about it?
Yeah, and also like when blackfellas, by the way, I'm the only one that can say that. When we call cops, the likelihood of us being arrested is very fucking high. So for an Aboriginal person or a Torres Strait Islander person to attend a police station, it's like a big deal, and they need to take it serious because it's the last resort. We don't go to police. Our family are our police. The first people we call when there's conflict in our communities or our families is our family, and the cops are our last resort, and they should know that. And I don't think any amount of training would ever make it better. There's no such thing as cultural awareness training to them. I mean, when I was a copper at the academy, it was a fucking snooze fest. They were all sleeping and I was the only one that was paying attention. I didn't need this awareness. They needed it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what Isabelle said, it gets to a point where the data or the fail to retain data, you've got to ask at what point it's intentional. And I also think that in a lot of the work that we do, we often try and find data to try and establish patterns and discrimination, and the data's not there. And then I think it gets to a point where if enough people are pointing to an issue and saying it's an issue that they're experiencing, and Aboriginal people are saying we're being targeted by police and it's discrimination, I think that we need to listen more. I think governments need to listen more. And that would, help address these issues.
I just want to make it's not just about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's vulnerable people, it's marginalised people, it's people who are homeless, it's people who are rough sleepers, it's people who come from the LGBTQIA plus community as well. So it's not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If you look different to the typical cop, which is a white cis male, then you will be targeted. And as a marginalised person myself and my family, I go to sleep wondering if any of my kids are going to be another death in custody. And I can't imagine a non-Indigenous person having that last thought before they go to sleep. Yep.
Yep. I don't. That's really powerful. Thank you, Ronnie. I wanted to pivot a bit, and Isabelle, you were talking about the NYPD, and a lot of your book is about talking about access to justice, but another part of the big theme in your book is about the rise of the anti-court movement in Australia, and kind of comparing that to what's going on in America with the hyper-politicisation of the appointments to the Supreme Court over there. Can you just explain what the anti-court movement is in Australia and how concerned we should all be about it?
Yeah, sure. And I guess to give it a bit of context before jumping into it. I think it's just useful for the audience to, if you think about our court system, and I'm really talking particularly about our court system that is focused on accountability for governments and corporate leaders. So I'm not so much talking about a criminal court system that is focused on criminalising people as according to our Crimes Act. But I'm talking about the courts that our cases are usually operating in, where you can hold governments accountable, are usually the federal court, the Supreme Courts, the tribunals that lead to them, and then the High Court as well. And I think it's important just to distinguish those slightly for the audience, just so you know what I'm talking about when I say there's actually a part of our court system that's worth holding on to, because it sort of doesn't really sound like it very much if you're talking purely about the criminal court system. And I'll just tell you one anecdote that kind of reflects this. It reflects both the worst of our system and I hope the best. I was recently on country in the Torres Strait for a climate change case that Grata Fund is supporting at the moment. It's being brought by Gudumalagal men from the northernmost part of the Torres Strait. They're actually in Melbourne at the moment for the expert evidence hearing. So if you're ever around William and Latrobe at the moment, pop into the federal court and have a listen to those hearings. So it's the expert science showing, telling the court essentially what the court has now already heard on country from Torres Strait Islander people, from traditional owners. It's now hearing it in sort of Western language and Western methods through these scientists. But when we were on country, we were there and we were chatting to court staff, and we've been in these beautiful on-country courts, which were unlike any kind of court that you would ever imagine. It's sort of community halls that are open to the humidity and the breeze and the rains, and they'd been beautifully and lovingly transformed by the communities in Boigu and Saibai and Bardu Islands, with beautiful weavings and flags and flowers and decorations. It was a really special experience to experience a court like that. And we then had some hearings in Cairns, because there's a large diaspora in Cairns from the Torres Strait. And we were in this, it was like it was an episode of The Office. It was this really boring, it was like an office works kind of building was the court venue for this part of the hearings, which, is fine, it did the job, but it wasn't very atmospheric. And we're working with a filmmaker, Maya Newell, who made a terrific film, In My Blood It Runs, which I really recommend to you if you haven't watched it yet, about following and co-produced with First Nations people in Central Australia, and about their experiences with the white education system. Anyway, Maya is making a film about the case with Uncle Pabe and Uncle Paul, who are bringing it. And she was saying to me, do you think we could get, the next time we're up in Cairns for hearings, which will be in April next year, do you think we could get the court in a bit more of an atmospheric building for me to film? Because it's pretty boring filming the court in this sort of office worksy looking building. And I said, I'll talk to the court staff and see what they say. And I said to the court staff, we're thinking, the Supreme Court down the road, it's like quite a nice looking building. It has a kind of good, evil, ominous presence to represent the government as the opponents in this case, the sort of kind of post-colonial building. And the court staff, and I didn't tell them my kind of naughty reason for wanting to suss out that venue, but the court staff very thoughtfully said to me, well, no, at the federal court, which is what this court is, which is the appropriate court if you're holding the federal government accountable for something, in this case climate change, the federal court would never have proceedings in the Supreme Court, especially not with First Nations people, because it is not a safe place for First Nations people. We know that witnesses will clam up, they won't talk freely, they won't feel comfortable, because for them there is such a strong association between the Supreme Court building and getting sent to jail because of our system. And I think that's a terrible kind of damning reality that, a whole court building could become to symbolise, everything that we've kind of heard about today, the failures of our criminal system. But I thought it was actually quite a good thing as well to think that there are genuinely court staff operating in Queensland, thinking thoughtfully about which court building they should use for the experience of the people who are going to be using it, in this case, First Nations people. So that's to say, there are really strong aspects of our court system, and you can see that really, I think, 30 years ago is the kind of high watermark where you see the Mabo decision, again, an important case out of the Torres Strait. And in that case, the court looked at the facts and said, the facts are overwhelming that there was violent, horrific dispossession of First Nations people from their land in this country, and that is a fact that our law has to catch up with. Our law is not up to scratch. We needed to update it to reflect the fact that there is this continuing connection to this country. There is property, land rights, ownership in this country that our law has failed to reckon with. And that, for many people across the country, was a really fantastic moment. It was also a moment for a group of vested interest, people really interested in maintaining their land rights to the expense of all others. So we're talking about agricultural industries, pastoral industries, mining industries, and a group of sort of what you would now think of as kind of ultra-right conservative politicians in Australia. And their response to that Mabo decision was complete outrage. They personally attacked judges in this very vitriolic manner that's completely out of step with how our legal system and political system, the norms of it, normally operate. And they sort of got slapped down for doing so. So Tim Fischer, who became Deputy Prime Minister while he was Deputy Prime Minister, literally was in Fairfax papers saying we need to call for the appointment of capital C Conservatives to our High Court bench. We can't have these radical activist decisions like the Mabo decision. And they got slapped down for it at the time because, you know, the legal community and the political community at that point was really maintaining the norms and saying, actually, that's not acceptable. You can't go after judges in this way. It's really problematic for our entire democratic system. And so that kind of anti-court movement didn't disappear. It just sort of went underground and took a different form. And so in the 30-odd years since the Mabo decision, it feels like 30 decades at the moment, this has been a long year. In the 30-odd years since the Mabo decision, instead what started to happen was this group of sort of loosely aligned interests started attacking aspects of the court in different ways. So they started calling the litigators and lawyers who represented refugees, Dutton called them un-Australian. It started defunding the Environmental Defenders Office entirely and describing legitimate environmental litigation as environmental lawfare. It became this sort of attack on the ecosystem that accesses the court and enables people to access the court. And I think kind of most alarmingly, and I think, you know, it should be of no surprise to anyone listening to this conversation or probably who's in the room tonight, that really when First Nations rights are at stake, First Nations people's rights are at stake and justice is at stake, is when that anti-court movement really rears its head and gets pretty angry. And you saw that, you know, most recently in 2020 with the Love and Tom's decision, which, to those of you who aren't familiar with the case, the government had basically decided that it would empower itself to send people overseas if they were Aboriginal but had been born overseas and they had committed a crime that resulted in a penalty of over about 18 months. So we know a lot of Aboriginal people, due to our legal system, are being committed to jail for crimes with a term of longer than 18 months. But when they served it, if they had been born overseas, so, you know, they happened to be born in Papua New Guinea, they happened to be born in New Zealand, but they were an Aboriginal person, they could be deported. And the court found, actually, no, you can't deport people. There is something unique about First Nations people and their connection to this country, which means you cannot deport them from this country. You cannot make them a non-citizen of this country, which was significant, and it followed on the precedent of the Mabo decision. But what it did is reared again. That was the first time since the Mabo decision that coalition of interests really reared its heads and started attacking judges individually again. So in the Australian, they printed out the image and name of every single judge who made that decision, whether they voted for or against it, whether they were an activist because they'd done, you know, the wrong thing by the Australians' metric or the right thing. And started again calling very widely, and this time, you know, with more gumption in other forum as well, for the appointment of capital C political conservatives to the High Court. It's 2020 at that point, and in 2020 there were 2 High Court appointments due to be filled. Various members of the government, you know, spoke at, you know, public forum, delivered speeches again calling for conservative appointments to the High Court. And one of these, I mean, they claimed both of the then appointments by Christian Porter as sort of wins for the Conservative movement. And, sometimes people count things as wins without them legitimately being wins, but one of those appointments does seem to have been a legitimate win. And that judge, in his sort of first decision, considering the implied freedom of political communication, decided that what was considered well-settled law was actually open for debate. Kind of basically planting a flag to say, okay, this is actually maybe, not as secure law as we thought. The reason I think that that's significant is it is the first step of what we have seen in America. And what we've seen in America is the use by the far right of abortion rights and the Roe v. Wade decision around abortion rights as a central organising pillar for conservative interests. It's driven a huge political movement in America. It's led to a hyper-partisan court system that has also destroyed abortion rights for much of the country. And what I see in parallel in Australia is the use of the Mabo decision and land rights as an organising principle of the right, of the far right in Australia, which will do anything it can to win its goals. And those goals are ultimately power. And along the way of achieving power, it will be prepared to destroy the court system, destroy kind of any respect of land rights that we've now got in our common law, and really anything else in its way as well. And I think it's something that you don't want to overstate. You don't want to say, we're going to be America next year. But it gave me pause for thought that Professor Adrian Stone, who's a really eminent constitutional scholar from Melbourne University, said on reflection of the kind of 30 years since the implied freedom decisions and this sort of recent decision by one High Court Justice that, maybe it wasn't such well-settled law. She said, I wouldn't have thought 15 years ago that Roe v. Wade could have been undone the way that it has been undone. And, that's a seriously, serious, eminent constitutional scholar, such that I really can never really tell her politics when I'm watching her speak. I'm always thinking, are you with us? Are you against us? I can't quite tell. And I think, that she is saying this is a red flag, should say to us all, this is a red flag. And so what do we kind of do about it becomes the next question. And I think, there are two things. One is we actually need to raise in our collective consciousness the role of the courts, not just as a place where people are sent to jail and the problems that are inherent with that, which are many, but also a really important vehicle that we've got to protect that gives us the potential to hold governments accountable. It's really the only place in our democracy where we are able to be treated on an equal footing, where actually governments get the same treatment as anybody else. And so the next part of that is, how do we as citizenry activate and actually use that court system? How do we become participants in it? What cases can we bring? How can we support communities to bring cases, to seek accountability for policing practices, to seek accountability for governments who use criminalisation of innocent people as part of their own political power plays? And there are ways that we can do that, and something that I'm pretty passionate about.
I'm going to get your number after this.
Good.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I've got one question, and then we might be able to fit in one or two questions from the audience. But my last question that I had written down was for you, Ronnie. Just thinking a lot about what Isabelle just said. Or we could just abolish everything.
Abolish fucking everything, yeah.
Tell me about abolition and what that means to you and what that is.
It's a journey for me. So I know that I still catch myself speaking like a cop and thinking like one, and reminded very quickly by my children. So it's about unlearning what I've learnt. Yes, that's what it's about. It's a journey, it's not a destination. But I'm getting better at it, We don't need police in the community. We can, the government should be given money into the community orgs to help out people in the community that are needing support. There's other ways to assist people and to not criminalise them and keep them out of the justice system as well. But that's the main aim of the cops, is to criminalise everyone, anyone that looks different to them. And it's working.
Totally. All right. So, time for questions. Does anybody in the audience have one for the panel?
It's always intimidating to get up in front of
Mum and Dad?
people.
Isabelle, can I just ask a quick question, following on from what you were saying at the end there? How do we stop, or how do we protect the court, the High Court, or the Federal Court, or that silo of courts that are judging administrative decisions? And how do we protect the Australian court system from what's happening in America, practically, like an oversight system or, transparent appointments, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, partly it's about reinstating the independent judicial appointments process that the previous government got rid of, and that's happening. Another part of it, unfortunately, is actually the complete disbanding of the AAT. So the AAT, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, is the first sort of court that you would go to if you had a problem with the government. So, for example, this is a long story. I'm trying to think of a short example of this. You are a person seeking asylum and you've had your visa rejected, and you think that you shouldn't have had your visa rejected. And so what you do is you go to the AAT to have them review whether you should have had your visa rejected, because the minister said, no, you don't get a visa. And the AAT has the opportunity to review whether the minister actually got it wrong. The AAT, that body, had become so politicised that you had double the chance of being rejected in that visa application review if you were being reviewed by an Administrative Appeals Tribunal member who had been appointed by the coalition versus by a Labor government. That is when holding for all the other variations that you get in any normal case. That's a really appalling statistic, and as a result, the now Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, announced upon this government's election that they would be disbanding the AAT altogether and creating a new tribunal process. That's sort of scorched earth. That's as kind of bad as it gets. So you kind of have to start from scratch sometimes. You have to have a proper independent judicial process. What I think you also need to do is be an active citizenry in accessing the courts. And what I mean by that is either you participating in the court as a litigant or you supporting other people to do so. So, for example, if you experience in your community or a community that you know something that you think the government is doing that actually is not lawful, that they shouldn't be allowed to do, that you actually investigate that you reach out to your community legal centre and you actually have those conversations about what are the pathways for us as citizens to hold the government accountable. Because the courts can only do as good a job as we enable them to do. We've actually got to bring the cases to them in the first place. The other thing that you can do if you just want to do a small thing that can make you sleep a bit better at night, that I recommend, is find a community legal centre that you really care about and donate to them regularly. Make sure that you're providing funding so that they can provide services to communities who really need to be able to access the courts to be able to deliver this sort of accountability.
Or you could pay the rent, actually, because you're all living on stolen land.
You can do that as well. I would say those are complementary things. And I mean, I think the thing that, for any lawyers in the audience, the thing that I'm quite passionate about and would never have thought to be passionate about at law school, I've never won for procedure. I always thought civil litigation procedure was the most boring possible thing, along with sort of property law and corporate law, but actually it turns out they're quite useful. And when it comes to litigation, there are some procedural things that actually make our system work way better as citizens wanting to hold governments accountable. And there are two things. One is it's really expensive to bring litigation against the government, even if you've got free lawyers. So you've got a great case, you've managed to find some amazing lawyers like Monique to provide you legal services for free. They'll help you bring a case. But the problem is if you lose your case against the government, even though you had a decent chance of giving it a go, you win some, you lose some in court. And if you lose, you're up for the other side's legal bill. That makes heaps of sense when it's Woolworths versus Coles, right? Yeah, that one of them loses, one of them has to pay the legal bill. But when it's a community against the government, it really doesn't make sense. And so the rest of the world of similar countries as Australia have changed their systems or developed their systems so they don't have that cost risk. So we've really got to change the way that cost risk works in Australia. What GRADA does is provide funding to get rid of the cost risk, but long term we actually need to change the way that works. The other kind of one on that in terms of the kind of seemingly boring procedure that actually makes a massive difference to how our democracy operates is standing. So who can actually bring a court case? So if you are a koala, you obviously cannot bring a court case against the government for approving a dodgy development. But the Alliance for Koala Survival can bring that case, which is a really, really good thing. That's really useful for environmental cases, but we don't have the same sorts of protections for other parts of our community. So if you are a vulnerable or marginalised group of people who are, for example, over-targeted by policing, say you're an Aboriginal boy in inner city Sydney and you are being over-targeted by policing as part of their advanced policing system where they basically can track you if they've decided that you might commit a crime in the future. You, as a little Aboriginal kid, cannot possibly bring that case against the police because you're immediately a target for further abuse and harassment by the police, as are your family and communities. And so we have, potentially really good cases that could be brought against police in that circumstance. But until we're able to have other organisations stand as the litigant and stand on behalf of people like that in court and to be able to face the brunt of what comes, we're really limited in how many people are actually going to be able to hold governments accountable and police and others accountable. So for lawyers, any lawyers in the audience, my kind of passion call to you is to actually get a bit invested in the kind of boring procedure of litigation and help me change those rules.
Also, in parts of this country, certainly in Victoria, so when there's a litigation case against police as an individual, hypothetically, I'll use a deaf in custody, they want indemnity up front. They want to know that if you don't win, that you're able to pay the court costs.
And the territories, policing in the territory, costs in the territory against police are shocking. You actually, even if you win, you still somehow end up having to pay the police for their costs. Like, it's a really mad system. I think the territory is really this weird hole in terms of policing and government in the territory, where the amount of absolutely appallingly unacceptable, unlawful actions take place. And to me, that's where I think there's so much exciting opportunity for litigation in the territory, actually, to hold these people accountable. Like in that housing case that I mentioned before, in an attempt to get out of that housing case, the territory countersued that community. This is a pretty impoverished people for $2 million in alleged rental debts. The community decided to keep fighting and they didn't know what they were talking about with the debts. And by the time they got to the tribunal, the government had their opportunity to argue their case about these rental debts and they had no evidence, to the point that the tribunal says, okay, well, I'll adjourn for half an hour, give you a break for 30 minutes to go collect your evidence, come back. They came back, they had no evidence. And so that counterclaim of $2 million to try and get rid of this case essentially was chucked out of court.
Does GRADA assist with the indemnities?
That's exactly what we do, yep.
Is it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting, because I just, so I'm the executive officer of Pay the Rent, and I've just had to pay indemnity, that one you refused as well, so, but we'll speak offline about that.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I don't want to, sorry.
That's all right, we're at time. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much to the panel. The panel will be signing books, so if anyone does have any burning questions that they didn't get to ask, you can go and say hi and buy a book and ask a question. But otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it.